I never thought a simple dinner would turn into a battle over my own home. But there I was, sitting across from my stepmother, the woman who had never hidden her disdain for me, as she announced, with all the arrogance in the world, that I needed to leave. "You've overstayed your welcome," she said, swirling her wine glass as if she wasn't appending my entire existence. "You're an adult, aren't you? It's time you figured out how to live on your own." I set my fork down slowly, my appetite suddenly gone. "You want me to move out?" She gave me that fake, pitying smile she always wore when she wanted to appear reasonable. "It's for your own good, darling. You can't stay here forever." My father, sitting silently at the head of the table, didn't even look up from his plate. I wasn't surprised. He rarely stood up to her. But I wasn't the same person I had been when she first married my father. I had grown. And more importantly, I knew something she didn't. "I appreciate your concern," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But I'm afraid that won't be possible." Her smile wavered. "What do you mean, it won't be possible?" I met her eyes directly, something that always seemed to unsettle her. "I mean, legally, I can't be kicked out of this house." For the first time, my father stiffened. He looked up, his fork frozen mid-air. My stepmother's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I sighed, standing up. If they were going to play this game, it was time I showed my hand. "Let's go to the study," I said. "I think it's time we had a little chat." She followed me, my father trailing behind, confusion etched into his aging face. The study was my grandfather's old office, a space I had reclaimed after he passed. It was filled with the scent of old books and leather, the heavy oak desk still bearing the scars of decades of use. I went straight to the safe, entered the code, and pulled out the stack of documents I had been holding onto for years. "You seem to believe this house belongs to you," I said, turning to face them. "But that's not entirely true." My stepmother's eyes flickered with something, uncertainty, perhaps. "What are you saying?" she snapped. I placed the deed on the desk. "This house doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me." Silence. My father exhaled sharply, like a man who had just realized he had stepped off a cliff. My stepmother's face twisted into something ugly. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "The house, your father never actually put it in his name," I finished for her. "Grandfather left it to me. The paperwork was finalized before I turned 18. I let the moment sink in before I continued. "So, to be clear, you're living in my house. And if anyone's leaving, it's not going to be me." For the first time since she married my father, my stepmother was speechless. And I intended to enjoy every second of it. She reached for the papers, her hands trembling as she skimmed through the legal wording. I watched as her lips parted slightly, her breath quickening as reality began to sink in. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I turned to him, my expression unreadable. "Because I never thought I'd need to." His face darkened with shame. Deep down, I think he already knew the truth, knew that his father had never truly trusted him with the family estate. That knowledge was probably why he had let my stepmother believe she would inherit everything someday. My stepmother slammed the papers back onto the desk. "This doesn't mean anything," she said, her voice dripping with forced confidence. "Your father and I have been taking care of this house for years. We've paid the bills, the taxes." "With my grandfather's trust," I interrupted. "A trust that legally transfers to me as well." The color drained from her face. My father ran a hand down his face. This is a mess." "No, it's actually pretty simple," I said. "You wanted me out. But the truth is, if anyone should be worried about leaving, it's you." She stood up so fast that her chair screeched against the wooden floor. "You ungrateful little." "Careful," I warned, my voice dangerously calm. "I might start considering my options." Her eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't dare." I smiled. "Wouldn't I?" She turned to my father, desperate. "Say something. You can't possibly be okay with this." He was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he sighed. "The deed is real, Eleanor." She flinched. I watched as she struggled to hold on to whatever illusion of control she thought she had. But I could see the cracks forming. She was realizing, in real time, that she had no power here. And that must have terrified her. You can't just expect us to leave, she finally snapped. I crossed my arms. That's funny. You expected me to leave just fine. She pressed her lips together so hard they turned white. I stepped forward, my voice lowering. I could make you leave, I said softly. I could file an eviction notice and have you out of here in 30 days. Panic flashed in her eyes. I let the words settle before continuing. But I won't. Not yet. Both of them looked at me, wary. I'll give you time, I said. Not much, but enough. But make no mistake, this is my house now. And from now on, we do things my way. I turned, walking toward the door. Before stepping out, I glanced back over my shoulder. Dinner's over, I said. You can clear the table. And then I left them standing there, drowning in their own disbelief. The silence stretched long after I left the study, but I didn't stay to enjoy it. I made my way to my bedroom, my grandfather's old master suite, a room my stepmother had always coveted. She once told me that when I moved out, she would redecorate it in her style, tearing out all the old wooden paneling and replacing it with something modern. I smiled to myself as I shut the door behind me. She wouldn't be changing anything now. I sat on the edge of my bed, my fingers running over the papers I had taken from the safe. Even though I had always known the house was mine, I had never wielded that knowledge as a weapon before. Maybe I should have. Maybe if I had, she wouldn't have treated me like an intruder in my own home for all these years. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I expected my father, but when I opened the door, it was my stepmother. She had regained some of her composure, but her eyes still held the wild, desperate look of someone scrambling to stay in control. We need to talk, she said. I crossed my arms. We already did. She exhaled sharply. This isn't a game, you know. There are real consequences to what you just did. You mean, to what I just revealed? I corrected. I didn't do anything except tell the truth. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for you. She stepped forward, lowering her voice as if we were conspiring. Listen to me, sweetheart, she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. You're young. You don't understand how these things work. Houses need upkeep, money, things your father and I have handled for years. With my trust, I repeated. Which you've been using to maintain my house. Her face twisted. You're being selfish. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Selfish? I repeated. You were about to throw me onto the street. And I'm the selfish one? You have your whole life ahead of you, she snapped. You could get an apartment, move to a city. I cut her off. No. You want me to leave so you can pretend this house is yours. That's not happening. Her fingers curled into fists. Your father. My father, I interrupted, never owned this house. He never even told me about the deed. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I would just go quietly? I could see the cracks forming. She wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by me. Her voice turned sickly sweet again. Darling, think about your father. You kicking us out would destroy him. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? And trying to kick me out wouldn't? She flinched. I stepped forward, lowering my own voice. You've spent years treating me like a burden, I said. Like I don't belong here. You had my father so wrapped around your finger that he let it happen. But that stops now. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but I wasn't finished. You have two choices, I said calmly. You can stay, for now. But I make the rules. Or, you can start looking for somewhere else to live. Her face went red. You can't just. I can, I said. And I will. You have until the end of the month to decide. I stepped back and shut the door in her face before she could respond. She stood there for a moment, and then, with a frustrated growl, I heard her stomp away. I exhaled slowly. I had won this round, but I knew she wouldn't give up so easily. The next morning, I found my father in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Morning, I said, grabbing a mug for myself. He didn't look at me. After a long pause, he finally sighed. I should have told you about the house. Yes, you should have, I agreed. He rubbed his face. Your stepmother. I don't want to hear it, I interrupted. She tried to kick me out of my own home, Dad. Don't sit here and make excuses for her. He sighed again but didn't argue. What are you going to do? He asked. I took a sip of coffee. I gave her until the end of the month to decide if she wants to stay under my rules or leave. He winced. That won't go over well. I don't care, I said. She doesn't get to bully me anymore. His silence spoke volumes. I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, I realized that he wasn't just disappointed in the situation, he was afraid. Not of me. Of her. Dad, I said slowly. Has she threatened you? He hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. I set my mug down. She has, hasn't she? It's complicated, he muttered. I felt something cold settle in my chest. No, it's really not, I said. You're afraid of her. His jaw tightened. She's my wife. That's not an answer. He finally met my eyes. I love her. I swallowed back my frustration. Then that's your problem, I said, standing up. But don't expect me to keep playing along. He didn't stop me as I walked out. That night, my stepmother made her next move. I was in my room, going through some of my grandfather's old papers, when I heard the sound of shattering glass downstairs. I rushed out of my room, my heart pounding. In the living room, my stepmother stood over the remains of a broken vase, one of my grandfather's favorites. She turned to me, her expression cold and defiant. Oops. I clenched my fists. What the hell are you doing? Just getting rid of some old junk, she said. Rage boiled in my chest. This isn't a game, I said through gritted teeth. She smirked. Oh, but it is, darling. I took a slow breath. You have until the end of the month, I repeated. But if you keep this up, I'll throw you out tomorrow. Her smirk faltered, just slightly. Good. Let her be afraid. I turned and walked away, my hands shaking with fury. If she wanted a war, she was about to get one. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The days that followed were like living with a viper coiled in the shadows, waiting, watching, ready to strike. My stepmother didn't leave, but she didn't accept my authority over the house, either. Instead, she chose to make my life as unbearable as possible. It started with small things. The thermostat mysteriously changing to freezing temperatures in the middle of the night. The Wi-Fi password being changed without warning. Items in the fridge going missing, conveniently, only my groceries. I knew what she was doing. She wanted me to react, to lash out, so she could play the victim. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I documented everything. Every instance of her pettiness, every insult muttered under her breath, every attempt to sabotage my space, I wrote it all down. If she thought I wouldn't be prepared to legally remove her when the time came, she was dead wrong. But she wasn't done escalating. One evening, I came home from work to find that my bedroom door wouldn't open. I jiggled the handle. Locked. I knocked, then pounded. Are you serious? From downstairs, I heard her laughing. Oh dear, did I accidentally lock it while cleaning? She called up sweetly. I clenched my teeth. Open it. Now. She took her time coming up the stairs. When she finally appeared, she was holding the key, twirling it between her fingers. You should really be more careful with your things, she said, dangling it just out of reach. I didn't move. I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I pulled out my phone, held up the screen, and took a slow, deliberate video of her standing there with the key. Her smirk faltered. I wonder what the police would say about you locking me out of my own bedroom, I mused. Her jaw clenched. I tilted my head. Go on. Keep playing your little games. But remember, I own this house. And I can have you removed. She threw the key at me. You're insufferable, she hissed before stomping downstairs. I caught the key, my hands steady, my heart pounding. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I made a call to my lawyer. I want to start the eviction process, I told him. He sighed. You sure about this? It's going to be messy. She made that decision for me, I said. How soon can I serve her? Legally, you have to give her a 30-day notice, he said. Since she's been living there with your father, she technically qualifies as a tenant. I resisted the urge to curse. But, he continued, if she damages the property, threatens you, or interferes with your ability to live peacefully in the house, we can file an emergency order to remove her sooner. I thought of the broken vase. The locked bedroom. The stolen food. I'll get you proof, I said. By the end of the week, the situation had escalated beyond childish pranks. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and rushed downstairs. The dining room window was smashed. The floor was covered in shards. My stepmother stood there, phone in hand, looking completely unbothered. What the hell happened? I demanded. She looked up with a smirk. Oh, I don't know. Maybe it was your fault for leaving the window unlocked. I stared at her. You did this, I said, realization sinking in. She shrugged. You can't prove that. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. I pulled out my phone, snapped a picture, then turned on the voice recorder. Would you like to repeat that? Her smirk faded. You're insane, she muttered, brushing past me. I sent the pictures to my lawyer immediately. His response was almost instant. Document everything. We'll move to remove her ASAP. I clenched my fists. The war had officially begun. The next morning, I served her the official eviction notice. She laughed when she saw it. Oh, honey, she purred, waving the papers. You really think this scares me? I didn't respond. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Your father won't let you do this, she whispered. My stomach twisted, but I didn't let it show. He can't stop me. She smiled, slow and cruel. We'll see about that. And then she walked away. I clenched my jaw. She thought she still had power. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The eviction notice had shattered whatever fragile truce remained in the house. My stepmother no longer bothered with passive-aggressive mind games, now, it was all-out war. She tried to rally my father to her side, whispering to him in hushed tones, shooting me glares across the dinner table. He avoided my gaze, looking as weary as ever, but I knew he was too weak to go against her outright. Can't we find a compromise? He asked me one evening, standing awkwardly in the doorway of my bedroom. I didn't even bother looking up from my laptop. What kind of compromise, Dad? Should I just let her keep making my life miserable in my own house? He sighed. It's not that simple. It is that simple. I turned to face him, keeping my voice steady. She tried to kick me out. She's been destroying things in this house. And she's made it clear she'll never accept that it belongs to me. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. She's manipulating you, I said. His expression darkened. You don't understand. No, Dad. You don't understand. I sighed, standing up. You have a choice to make. You can either keep letting her control you, or you can stand up for yourself. He looked at me for a long time. Then, without another word, he turned and left. I knew, in that moment, that he wouldn't choose me. 2 days later, I came home to find my stepmother standing in the foyer with a real estate agent. I froze. What the hell is this? She turned, all fake smiles and syrupy charm. Oh, darling. I was just giving Mr. Langley a tour. You see, since you're so eager to make changes around here, I thought why not sell the house? My blood ran cold. The real estate agent, sensing tension, gave a polite cough. Ms. Ellison called me about a possible listing. I wasn't aware. She doesn't have the right to sell this house, I cut in sharply. I own it. The agent blinked. Oh. Well, that changes things. I turned to my stepmother. Get out. She crossed her arms. I was just exploring options. I stepped closer, my voice dropping. I don't care what you were doing. You don't get to explore anything in my house. For the first time, real fear flickered across her face. The agent awkwardly gathered his papers. I'll just be going. As soon as the door shut behind him, my stepmother snapped. You ungrateful brat, she screeched. I have spent years making this house a home. You think you can just push me out like some stranger? Yes, I said flatly. Because that's exactly what you are to me. She let out a short, furious breath. You're making a mistake. No, I said. The mistake was letting you think you had any power here. Her face twisted with rage. You'll regret this. I held her gaze. Get out. She stomped up the stairs, slamming the bedroom door so hard the walls shook. I took a deep breath. The countdown to her final day had begun. The last straw came a week later. I woke up to the sound of my father shouting. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and ran downstairs. He was standing in the living room, his face red with anger, his voice shaking. My stepmother stood across from him, arms crossed, smug and defiant. What's going on? I demanded. My father turned to me, looking humiliated. She drained my bank account, he said quietly. I blinked. What? He held up his phone, his hands trembling. She took everything. Every last dollar. I turned to my stepmother, a cold fury settling into my bones. You did what? She smirked. He let me handle the finances for years. If he was too stupid to see what was happening, that's his fault. My father clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. I exhaled slowly. You're done here. She rolled her eyes. I'm not going anywhere. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling the police. Her smirk faltered. You wouldn't. I started dialing. She lunged forward, trying to grab the phone from my hand, but I dodged her easily. This is your final warning, I said coldly. You can walk out of this house, or I will have you dragged out. She hesitated for the briefest second. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed upstairs. I looked at my father. You enabled this, I said quietly. But you're still my dad. So I'll help you get back on your feet. He looked away, ashamed. I don't deserve that. No, you don't, I agreed. But I'm not her. He swallowed hard but didn't argue. That evening, my stepmother came downstairs with 2 suitcases. She didn't look at me. I'll be back for the rest, she muttered. No, I said. You won't. Her head snapped up. I'll send your things to wherever you end up, I said. But after tonight, you don't set foot in this house again. She opened her mouth, then shut it. Finally, with one last glare, she grabbed her suitcases and walked out the door. The second it closed behind her, I locked it. And just like that, she was gone. The silence that followed my stepmother's departure was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It wasn't just the absence of her voice, her passive-aggressive sighs, or the sound of her expensive heels clicking against the floor, it was the absence of tension, of feeling like I had to be on guard every second in my own home. I stood by the front door for a long time after I locked it, half expecting her to come storming back in, demanding to be let inside, claiming some imaginary right to stay. But she didn't. She was gone. And I had one. My father didn't say much in the days that followed. He spent most of his time in his study, drinking his coffee in silence, staring at his bank statements, trying to figure out what life looked like without her. For all his faults, I knew he was lost. I tried to help where I could. I called a lawyer, helped him freeze the remaining accounts, and ensured he had a place to stay while he sorted out his finances. But one evening, as I stood in the doorway of his study, I realized something: he was never going to change. She's been calling me, he admitted, running a hand down his face. Says she wants to work things out. I swallowed my frustration. And what did you tell her? He hesitated. I clenched my jaw. Dad. She was my wife, he said, his voice tired. I can't just cut her off like that. I exhaled slowly, nodding. Then I guess you'll be leaving too. He looked up at me, startled. I let you stay because I thought you understood that things were going to be different, I said, crossing my arms. But if you're going to let her keep a hold on you, if you're going to keep letting her use you, then you can go. For the first time, I saw something crack in his expression. You'd really throw me out? He asked quietly. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Dad, I love you. But I'm done cleaning up after your mistakes. You have to choose what kind of life you want. If you want to go crawling back to her, fine. But you won't do it from inside my house. He looked down, staring at the desk, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He didn't argue. A week later, my father moved out. He found a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, but enough for him to figure things out. I helped him pack, but I didn't try to talk him out of it. "I don't blame you," he said before he left. "For any of this." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. Because honestly, I didn't care whether he blamed me or not. I had done what needed to be done. The house felt different with both of them gone. Lighter. Freer. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath in my own home. I could walk through the halls without worrying about snide comments. I could sit at the dinner table without forced conversation. I could exist. And that was worth everything. 3 months later, I had the locks changed. Not because I was afraid of my stepmother coming back, no, she had finally given up her desperate attempts to weasel her way back in, but because it felt symbolic. This house was mine, truly mine, in every way that mattered. I had won the war. And I had no regrets. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.